Welcome everyone to Reach Society's Ask Our Experts, and this is our second session. This one is entitled Recognizing and Conquering Trauma in the Modern Black Community. And I'm really delighted that we have a panel of experts. And what we're going to be doing today is to provide an in-depth analysis on this important subject of trauma, both recognizing it and conquering it. So let me give you a very brief summary of the 6 individuals that we've got this evening as our panel of experts. Firstly, we've got Emeritus Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, OBE, Barley Abrasion Process Inventor, Human Rights Champion, and author. Our second expert is Dr. Dwain Neil OBE. He is Chairman of Reach Society. He's the business leader and also an author. Our third panelist is Professor Frank Chinegwundoh, MBE, who is a consultant surgeon and chairman of Cancer Black Care. So our fourth panelist is Angela Clarke, psychologist, counsellor, adult health and social care manager, and RAFFA CEO. Our fifth panelist is Paul Riddell, equality, diversity and inclusion consultant and Enfield Caribbean Association deputy chairman. And then our final panelist is Dr. Keith Davidson, former Adventist educator, education director and head teacher, and is currently a CAD publisher and author. So can I say a warm welcome to you all, and I really like to thank you for taking the time to participate in Reach Society Ask Our Experts, where we'll be, as I said, providing a real in-depth analysis on recognizing and conquering trauma in the modern Black community. So to begin this interrogation, I'd really like to ask one of our panelists, and specifically Angela Clarke, I'd really like to ask you if you could define the main categories of trauma and how this then might suffer, what people might suffer from. Angela, I wonder if you could give us that sort of overview, please.
Thank you, Donald. Firstly, I'd like to say thank you for having me on this platform, especially with the esteemed colleagues that are with me. I count it a privilege, so thank you for that. Yes, I will go into just 3 areas, I think, the 3 main areas of trauma. And I know that we're talking about trauma in the Black community, but I'm going to stick with the 3 areas and then we can talk about it later on. There are different types of trauma. I suppose I need to start and say that there are different types of trauma. So the 3 main ones that I'm talking about are the main ones, and there are different offshoots of trauma, but I'll go into that a bit more later. And they are neither exclusive or independent of each other. So we need to pay particular attention to this. But the 3 main ones that I'm going to be talking about this evening is firstly acute trauma, and then I'm going to touch on chronic trauma, and then complex trauma. Those are the 3 main recognized areas of trauma. So acute trauma, it's normally associated to a single event, such as an assault or an accident or maybe a natural disaster. So this can compromise a person's physical and emotional well-being, and it can actually also lead to what is called PTSD, and that, although that is a complex trauma, but it can lead to that. And there are other causes and symptoms that will occur, like extreme anxiety, avoidance of certain environments and things like that. But a repeated exposure to an acute trauma or a traumatic event can then develop into what is called chronic trauma, especially if it's left untreated. And these can manifest these manifest in different ways. They appear after a long time. So after the initial event, if someone doesn't get the right treatment for the initial acute trauma, and then it's repeated, it can then go into chronic trauma. That it can provide the onset of different forms of anger, anxiety, and also trouble with interpersonal relationships. Related to that is also something that I know that we're going to touch on, and that's where you can get vicarious trauma. So that, you know, that's where, you know, it is repeated and it's ongoing, and actually can be based on actually hearing a story, hearing about a traumatic event, or actually seeing you know, horrific pictures and things, like horrific material relating to trauma. But the complex trauma it refers to exposure to multiple traumatic events. So not just the one-off. You remember what I said about acute? It's a one-off event. When it talks about chronic, it's a repeated event. But the complex trauma relates to multiple traumatic events that happen repeatedly, but over a long period of time. So, for example, it could be something like profound neglect, suffering or witnessing abuse, things like torture and slavery, and we'll come on to that, because there are some studies that show that children who've been exposed to abuse in their early life go on to exhibit behavioral issues like aggression and mistrust, and that's a result of complex trauma, and it can actually lead to complex PTSD symptoms, where, you know, when there isn't the support that's needed, which can then result in things like shame and guilt, impaired memories as well. Because if you have multiple traumatic events, sometimes a way of coping with that is actually to just forget that it ever happened and put it in the back of your mind, so that you are so desensitized when you're asked about the event, you know, your memory of it is quite detached. So that's really the complex trauma. As I said, all of three are interrelated, and they all have different symptoms, different behaviors that can emerge from them. So yeah, that's really the main areas. And if you want, and there are others, you know, you know, there is now racial trauma, intergenerational trauma, but we'll come on to that through the course of the evening. I hope that's answered your question.
No, thank you, Angela. You really set the scene in describing the various trauma, and I'm glad you mentioned, you know, like racial trauma, you know, that we're going to discuss, and also this idea of that you know, that I've been picking up, called transmitted trauma.
Yeah, generational.
And generational, and that's interesting because it appears in some cases that like racial trauma is something that's not been fully recognized until very recently.
That's correct.
So I'd like to expand, now that we've sort of captured some idea of what trauma means and what it is. And as I said, part of our discussion is recognizing it and then conquering it. So I'd like to open this up now to my fellow panelists, who I hope they don't mind, you know, sharing their own personal experience of what trauma is from them. I wonder if they could, you know, talk about, if you could share your personal experience of trauma. And what I'll do, I'll start with Dwain. I'll start with you first, Dwain, if you don't mind, and to give your take on this, and then I'm going to ask my fellow panelists.
Yeah. Good evening, Donald. Thank you for the opportunity to talk about my experience of personal trauma. I can think of several situations which I found traumatic, but the two I'm quite happy to share. The first really is the loss of my father. I was no more than 10 years old, and he passed away in less than a week. And in fact, it was doubly hard to accept because only a couple of days before, myself and siblings and my mother visited him in hospital. He collapsed at work, was taken to hospital, and 2 or 3 days we then went to see him. My mum had gone to see him every day, but then 2 or 3 days later, everyone went to see him, and a couple of days later we got the news that he had died. And that was a real hammer blow, because my father was my first hero and my abiding hero, because I modeled myself on him in so many ways. And the other experience of trauma happened when I was 39, so almost 40 years later. And you won't be surprised to hear me saying that was when my mother passed away. And her situation was very different. She was visiting with my sister in the States, and she had not long started to drive. The lights changed. She was in traffic, just making her way across a junction, and someone jumped the light perpendicular to her and crashed into her. And she was seriously injured. And despite the efforts of the hospital, she passed away within a few days as well. Now, I found that really, really hard to take, because here I was 5,000 miles away, and there was my mum severely injured, and there was absolutely nothing I could do. And that's what I kept on telling my wife at the time. This is just horrible, not just her passing, but the sense of helplessness. So those two experiences of trauma, I don't think I'll ever forget them. I've come to terms with them because they've happened some time ago, but I'll never forget them.
No, thank you, Dwain, and we really appreciate your, your honesty and able to share that experience. I mean, it's, you talk about, not, being helpless, and, as we're slowly coming out of this pandemic, and I'm hoping, particularly Angela and others may want to comment on this as we discuss, because it seems that, when we talk about health and well-being, it seems sadly the pandemic has really exacerbated that in many ways, not just in terms of isolation, but some aspect of our community which is around bereavement and how we bereave. We've not been able to do that, and that sense as well is something I know in our community, and speaking to others, it's been, they've not been able to do that. So that's impact a number of ways, and perhaps we can explore this. So I want to get my other fellow panelists perhaps to share again a traumatic experience. So Keith, Dr. Keith Davidson, I wonder if you got a moment that you'd like to share. And I think you are on mute, sir.
Yes, thank you, Donald, for the invitation to speak on this topic along with other colleagues who are here. I'm going to link mine with the situation that we're probably confronting today, the change in the way young people may respond to what's happening with education, etc. So for me, when I came to this country in 1964, I was just 14 and a half or so. I came from Jamaica and I was doing well at school. I had a scholarship to go to Homewood Technical College in Mandeville. I also passed an exam, what would have been the first stage to what is called the Senior Cambridge exam. So I came here doing well. But when I got to school, I was placed into a very low class. The things that that we were doing, I would have been doing those things 4 years back or so. And it was very depressing, undermining. And I was very unhappy. I felt kind of insulted that with my background, this is what I'm now enduring, this type of environment where, it's unstimulating, it's not motivating. And the only thing I could do was to complain to my mother, and God bless mothers. So she went on to school, and to the school, and she went to see the head teacher. She didn't go to see the class teacher or the head of year. She went to see the head teacher. And told him that her son was unhappy at school with respect to the work and the environment, and that she didn't ask him to consider moving me. She said, demanded that I be moved and be taken to another class more suitable to my my experience back in Jamaica. And so that really helped. It wasn't totally the best class. I believe I should have been further up, but it helped. But to me, remember now, the context of this is that I came here with that sort of background. And now I'm placed into a situation where I was in a strange place, but worst of all now, very uncomfortable with what I was experiencing at school. And I remember it to this day. So it was something that really affected me for those few weeks that I had to endure that. And I say that because I feel that it is something many others experience when they came to this country to join their parents. So it was not unique to me, but I'm raising it because it's something that many experience.
No, thank you, Keith. And that's something perhaps we may touch upon, because I know recently there was the BBC documentary about, education subnormal, which was relation to Bernard Cord's book around,
How do you say the child was
black
made
children.
in subnormal?
Yeah, and people still talk, some of the children who experienced that, who are now adults, still talk about that period as being incredibly traumatic on them, to the point where I was reading about one individual who has subsequently gone back to school to study to prove wrong. So you're right, and that trauma, it's coming. It's almost like what Angela's describing as incredibly complex, because it's literally affected their lives throughout. And we may touch on that, because I want us to ask, once we discuss all our our personal stories, I really want us to look at trauma within the Black community. So can I get Professor Frank Chinegwundoh to give his take on a personal experience, if he may, please.
Yes, thank you, Donald, for this opportunity. I think my theme is really on bereavement, quite recent bereavement. So still kind of processing it, really, which was the death of my father from COVID in London just over a year ago, actually. And the trauma of that was not being able to visit in hospital, also not expecting the outcome, and so therefore not being prepared. And although he was a good age, he was 92, but a good 92. So the family kind of joke was, getting the telegram from the Queen at 100, which was, all our expectations, because there was no reason why he wouldn't. And, the other parts that adds to the trauma is, the lockdown being too late. We have this feeling that if the lockdown had been earlier and, PPE, particularly for people coming into the home, carers coming into the home, had been enforced, then perhaps we wouldn't be where we are today. So that just adds to it. But the unexpectedness of it, the suddenness, the lack of an opportunity to prepare as one would, plus the ongoing loss. So as a family, we're still working through that bereavement process.
Yeah, thank you for sharing that, Frank. And I get you're right. And because the situation with COVID is still ongoing, and I guess the situation is it's further traumatic on many of us because, and particularly as you work in the health service, you realize certain things, it would appear, could have been done but didn't get done, and that just adds to it as well. And you know, the mistakes, you know, that certain, you know, the powers that be still, even now, still make, and you think, wow. So and again, and the what's even worse with COVID is the disparity in our community as well. So so can I get Professor Geoff Palmer to talk about you know, a personal traumatic experience? So Geoff, thank you for coming and for being here.
Well, thank you very much for inviting me. And, you know, it's a sort of a privilege sitting amongst, as I would regard it, as my own people, talking about our, you know, what experience we've had. But what I will do is to not so much talk about my own experience as such. I might mention a little about that. But one of the things which I observed, you know, and my mother came to Britain in 1951, and I came in 1955. And I think what a lot of people do not say understand, it probably wasn't recognized as, you know, this is just the way people lived. Now, here's a woman who has never traveled 10 miles in Jamaica before, leaves her children with her sisters, and she travels to London, no accommodation because people weren't renting rooms. She had to stay in the Salvation Army. That's where she lived. She had to get a job at night. She then had jobs which were uncertain because she was working at night because she couldn't get a job during the day. This is somebody who's never done that kind of work before, or not lived in that way. And therefore, a lot of the Windrush generation from the 50s, that's how they lived. And when I came in 55, I could see the, to me, trauma is an experience that has a lasting effect, and it's a lasting negative effect. And if I followed her life of job uncertainties, uncertainties of accommodation, uncertainties of language and the way one is treated, and therefore I could see the long-term effect of that, you know, before she died, you know, in 2003. The point is that from 1951, these repeated experiences and these negativities and trying to hold on to your accommodation, trying to hold on to your job, not being able to afford, just about afford to live. And when she, you know, in the later part of her life, you know, some people could say she was slightly going off her head. You know, this is what we would describe it as. But that is an experience of trauma, which I say I define as an experience or experiences that has or have a long-lasting negative effect. And many of us, and many of our people, and in addition to, she had in the family, say if I had a brother and he had various difficulties too. So all those effects, when I looked at her before she died, you could see the effect of that trauma. And there was no treatment because people regarded that as normal. and therefore, what we have to do is to look at our community and look at that result, you know, of people being ill, they're in shock, not being able to cope. And that is a result of that traumatic experience.
No, thank you, Sir Geoff. And, you know, that's, you know, something we're going to come to, because you talk about the experience of your mother and you know, in terms of housing, you know, accommodation and, job, get employment. These are all important areas for our community, and that's given the impact it's had. And I'd like to get everyone's thoughts once we've heard from Paul. That really illustrates, the idea of racial trauma, and one where, the impact of systemic racism. And once we've heard from Paul, I really want us to what Sir Geoff said, see if we can sort of focus on that in terms of examples. But before we get more into that, Paul, thank you for coming. I wonder if you could provide us with your personal experience of trauma, please.
Thank you, Donald. Like Dwain, I've experienced quite a few actually, but I wanted to just mention two. I was going to mention school, but I think a lot of us that arrived in the 60s had a very similar experience to the one that Keith mentioned, but I may be able to come back to it later. The first one I'd like to talk about was I was 16 and I was the victim of a racial attack. I was badly beaten by a gang of white boys who racially abused. I knew it was a racial attack because of the language that they used while they were beating me up. But the trauma came, and I think this fits in what Angela was saying, when I was filled with anger and rage. And I would say it went on for many, many years. I was not able to deal with it. But I think that was the worst one, because obviously it was life-threatening. I thought it was life-threatening at the time. And it stays with me today. I still actually have this habit that if somebody's in my car with me, and I've taken my kids as an example and actually showed them the very spot, including my wife, in which I was actually attacked. And I took, after I was beaten up, I actually got into the habit of actually walking it constantly in order that I could deal with the fear that it had instilled in me, and anger, I suppose. So I think that would be number one, that I think many of us at that time had experienced. It wasn't unusual. And certainly in the area that I lived in Edmonton at the time, it was quite commonplace to hear of, black boys in particular being beaten up by gangs of white boys. So I think that was the first one. The second one I wanted to mention is a really kind of strange one. And I think this kind of fits into the stuff that Angela mentioned about the vicarious trauma. And it was a very strange case. And, I've been involved in equality now for about 5 years. And as part of that, as you know, I work for the Commission for Racial Equality. A lot of my time was spent doing formal investigations. And I won't bore you with the details of the legal bit of it. But we had an ex-employee of a recruitment agency in the city came to us and told us about how the company was discriminating against Black and minority applicants. So we went through the due process and decided we're going to do an investigation. Dwain's familiar with this. As part of it, we decided that we're going to do a big record search, go in there, have a look at all their files, take as much information down as we possibly can and analyze it. Now you have to remember, these were the days when there wasn't much computer, so much of the stuff was handwritten. And we couldn't find very much, but we kept on searching, and eventually we noticed that stickers, just little stickers on forms dotted around, yellow stickers, green stickers, blue stickers. So I contacted the informant and said, look, I need to ask you something because we struggled to find any information, but we have found some odd stuff about stickers. And she said, oh, I can tell you what that is. And what had happened was they got to a point where they could no longer remember the African Caribbean applicants. So as an example, the name could be Donald Palmer, born in the UK, educated in the UK, been to university. So of course, when they put it back in the file, they may forget that Donald is Black. So they came up with a system that they started using color codes in order that they could remember the Black Caribbean applicants who were born here. For you know the reason why? One, they were being given instructions by employers not to send them Black applicants, not to refer them. And the second thing that they were doing was, if they had a client which they deemed to be prestigious, they didn't want to refer Black applicants. And I've got to be honest, I would say this was probably late 80s. And I was completely freaked out by the depth to which they were willing to go to discriminate. And just to finish very, very quickly, I'll tell you why it bothered me so much. I asked to contact some of the people that were found, and I contacted 3 Black people that were, that I could see at forms. They were highly qualified, and I noticed that they weren't being regularly referred to jobs. None of them would accept that they were discriminated against. They all described a situation where they were well treated, people interviewed them were polite and friendly. And one of the things that really struck me about it was how easy it was for organizations to discriminate. And I had to tell that story because I was personally quite traumatized by that experience. Thank you, Donald.
No, thank you. And I'd like to thank all of you, for sharing your personal stories about trauma. Because I guess, we talk about health and well-being, and it's an area that, is stigmatized, and it's something which we don't talk about, more so in our community, I would say. And maybe by talking about it more, it would lead to both, greater recognition and something whereby sharing our stories, we recognize that can help the trauma process. And what Paul, what you and Sir Geoff have highlighted is, the aspect of, of racism. So I want folks to, and Keith sort of mentioned this. So I want us to delve in a bit more, because I wonder.
Donald, can I just interject here?
Yeah.
I'd love to hear from Angela as well as part of the team.
Yes, I was about to get Angela's point. So Angela, before we get into everyone, we'd like to hear your personal story.
Okay.
She didn't want to say anything. She was hoping, yes.
No, not at all. In fact, no, I thought long and hard about what I was going to say even before I came here, because I wanted it to be relevant, and knowing that I have experienced multiple traumas, and I could have concurred with Frank, with Dwain, with regards to loss, even recently during COVID. But I thought that what I would do is to just give an example of something that can go from acute to complex. I suppose that's the easiest way to do that. And I'm just going to lay my vulnerability out here, because I've learned to be able to express it. So my trauma, I think the most traumatic experience, close to my mother dying of COVID, I suppose, and then my brother shortly after, goes back now 42 years this year, it will be. And I was a teenager at the time, and I was raped as a teenager. And although it was of course it was a one-off event, which would be classified as acute, what it did was, the effect that it had on me is that I was totally desensitized. I couldn't speak. I didn't tell anybody. I couldn't share it. I couldn't tell my mom. I couldn't tell I didn't tell a single soul. And, the effects of trauma, as I've talked about, guilt, shame, all sorts of things come into that. Thought it was my fault. I was as a child, I was a bit of a tomboy. So it's not that I was promiscuous in any shape or form, never had any kind of sexual experience prior to that. And yeah, it was a person that I was supposed to be babysitting for. So it was a one-off event, but what it did to me was it caused me to go into, it was a traumatic experience that lived with me. So although I didn't speak about it, What happened the weeks, months and days after that, I never ever went back to the house. So I never had to go back there. But what I did do was do things like sleep with a knife under my pillow. I used to have nightmares. So it was going from the one-off acute, and it was going into the chronic, and then it was going into all over stages. So that wasn't, although that was the traumatic, well, let me say a traumatic part of it. The most traumatic bit for me was because of the fact that I was silenced, or felt like I was silenced and couldn't share it with anybody. I carried on, went into depression. My mum noticed that there was something not quite right, took me to the doctors, and the doctor said, there's nothing wrong with your daughter, just send her on a holiday. And this was over a period of months. You know, he asked me some questions and did some examinations, nothing major, but then my mum decided to send me on holiday. Now, 6-week period. So I went from July to September, went away to my grandmother's house, stayed there and tried to forget about the experience, but it was still there. But it was only while I was there that I realized that I was actually pregnant. Didn't look pregnant, didn't have any, I wouldn't even have known even if I did, but it wasn't until I was there, I had the 6 weeks, almost 2 months period in Canada, and realized that I was pregnant on the day that I was due to come home. And by this time, I was having menstruation. So by the day I was due to come home, I started to bleed, and I said to my grandmother, I don't feel good. And she said, don't worry, it's just nerves, just, you're going home. I was put on the plane, packed off after having 2 months of trucking with my uncle and everything. And then went into labor on the plane. So not only had I had the trauma, the initial trauma, not only had I had to live with it for 9 months with nobody knowing, nobody any the wiser, but then I was on this plane on my way back to the UK, sitting next to someone who thought that I was just scared of flying because I kept going backwards and forwards to the toilet every so often until I didn't come back from the toilet, and until I was there pretty much giving birth on my own in the toilet. And I was there, and I'm not going to go into the graphics because there's no need, but I pretty much in there gave birth on my own as a teenager, and of course almost losing my life also. But it wasn't until the one thing that got me, and I'll never forget this, was the fasten your seatbelt sign that came up when I was in the toilet. And I realized that I couldn't go anywhere because I had a child attached to me, couldn't do anything. And I can talk about it now because I've been through the process. So I'm just evidencing and demonstrating how, I've been through it. But I remember when they kept knocking on the door and saying, you have to return to your seat. You have to return to your seat. And in the end, I opened the door and I looked at the stewardess and I said, can you help me? I've just had a baby. And she looked down and she saw the blood everywhere and she fainted right there and then. And long story short, I managed to, obviously they made a decision as to whether to turn the plane around and go back where we were coming from or carry on to the UK. And they decided to come on to the UK. But by the time I arrived at Gatwick Airport, the press had been informed. So they were trying to get me into Crawley Hospital, and all I could see was flash, flash, flash of cameras. So that, I've said it in a very quick, but you can imagine, if you think of how traumatic that must have been, that was definitely the most traumatic period that I have ever faced. But I can talk about it without getting emotional. I can talk about it as if it's a story. It doesn't mean that it doesn't impact me. It doesn't mean that every time I go on a plane, I don't have flashbacks when I'm going to the toilet, that this is where I actually gave birth to my eldest son. So that's, I suppose that is, I wanted to be real. I wanted to keep it real. I didn't want to just tell you something, because it's an important subject. And from that stemmed a lot of different things, but it was just for me, it was and is the most traumatic thing that I have ever had to face. And I have shared it with my colleagues on the platform.
Yeah, thank you, Angela. That's really brave, and we all feel what you've been feeling. And I mean, it will probably strengthen our friendship, because you're a hero.
Yeah.
So thank you for sharing that.
I don't know whether to cry or clap. It's incredibly powerful.
Wonderful.
Yeah. No, thank you.
Astonishing.
A true example of trauma.
Amazing.
Definitely.
But it's an example of how you coped, which is to me, the important aspect, so people can take, that they can help themselves.
Yeah.
So it's wonderful. Well,
Incredibly brave.
Surely we can say she conquered in the end.
yeah.
Amazing.
It's an amazing story.
Amazing
Absolutely
story.
unbelievable.
Yeah.
Thank you for sharing.
Yeah. Wow.
And as you say, you made yourself vulnerable by
Remarkable story. Remarkable. Amazing.
You're amongst friends, Angela, so we all understand.
Yeah.
We all understand.
But that what's remarkable, and I guess part of the process of healing, as you said, is by being vulnerable, is by being open. And part of that, when we talk about, maybe supporting one another, is by sharing that can help. And sometimes, when we talk about in your situation or with other trauma, it's by talking to someone and sharing that. And even someone just having a listening ear might just be sufficient to help someone.
Yeah.
They may, it's difficult. I'm not a specialist, and we're not here to talk about, specialist treatment. But, sometimes just by talking and then let it process can also be a powerful tool of help.
It took me a long time, Donald, to be able to talk. As I said, I was silent for 9 months, but it didn't, just because I gave birth, I still wasn't able to talk. It took me many years. And I suppose maybe it was what drew me into being a counsellor and psychotherapist myself.
Yes.
To do that, you have to go through your lived experience. You have to deal with your issues before you can help someone else. It's like they say on the plane, you put on your own oxygen mask before you can help someone else. So I had to go through the painful, period of not self-healing, but healing, the healing process. And it wasn't easy, but yeah.
And we often talk about that, isn't it? The key is of our lived experience.
Yeah.
And I wonder, having heard Angela, what do we feel? Can others comment on, the lived experience of our community?
Mm-hmm.
What, and particularly what Keith has mentioned and Sir Geoff and others have mentioned is that, can you guys share some of the observations of the signs and symptoms of trauma of people in our community? And I heard Paul say that he was angry of a situation, and I should point out, and I can say this publicly because he aired it on TV. So I don't know if anyone of you watched the documentary on BBC Two about Bristol. It's the summer of 2020, and basically it was a fly on the wall documentary featuring the Bristol mayor, Mervyn Rees. And he's mentioned this previously, and you'll see it if you've watched it. He talks about constantly being angry. He still says, "I'm angry even now." So as a young man, he grew up in a poor housing estate, and he went back there, and he talked about the racial abuse that he suffers, and And the reason why he's still angry even today was you saw the still current racial abuse that he was getting. So you saw the letters he was getting, and you know, but he says I got to try and deal with it because I'm a public official. So it's a very open, and again, he was doing what you were doing, Angela, being open and honest, and in part being vulnerable. You know, if you're a public official, but if you're saying I'm constantly angry, but I'm really working on dealing with it. So that's just one example. But I wonder if anyone would want to comment and share any other observations of that kind of trauma that I suspect many of us experience, but perhaps we're not aware of it. And it only manifests itself, you know, later on.
Yeah.
Well, I mean, that is one of the theories as to why our youth are behaving towards each other as they do. Not just here, but it's the same story in the States. It's the same story in Canada, and there's quite a lot of literature about this. And you know, one thought is that there's the concept of intergenerational traumas. So things that affected your grandparents and your parents can affect you, even though you may not realize it or appreciate it. And the way around that is to actually recognize it and not just deal with the immediate events, not just deal with the immediacy of the criminal justice system or the, you know, expelling kids from schools, but actually recognizing that this is a trauma that's been handed down through generations, and it has to be spoken about and acknowledged and recognized before it can be dealt with. Otherwise, we carry on with the current self-harm, you know, community self-harm.
Donald, I'd like to come in on the back of what Frank has said, because we talk about intergenerational trauma, but my take on the signs and symptoms of trauma in the wider Black community is this. I saw my parents' generation, because they're Windrush generation, having to go through the experiences which people euphemistically refer to when you're trying to find accommodation: no dogs, no Irish, no Blacks. And I know of family members and friends who had a tough time finding employment that was consistent with their training and qualifications. So that whole generation has had lots of negative interpersonal relationship with people in this country. That's part and parcel of living in a systemically racist environment. I also know that my generation, which some people refer to as the barrel generation, have had similar experiences to the Windrush generation of my parents. School was like running a gauntlet. There was never a time when there wasn't one or more teachers who were being openly racist to Black children. And that was not a one-off, it was a consistent thing. There was never a time when you didn't see young people having to defend themselves and just going from A to B in the community. There was never a time when you weren't aware, because people were talking about it, or you witnessed it yourself, where the police were being abusive to young people. I witnessed that several times making my way home from Boy Scouts, where for no apparent reason, a couple of Black men were making their way ahead of us. Police car comes screeching by and for no reason started to lay into them. They weren't hooded and running away as if they were criminals. They were just making their way, but they were the target at the time. So my generation, you know, the barrel generation, people born in overseas but came to join their parents here, have suffered similar experiences of systemic racism. And I can see in our children's generation, which I'm referring to as the British-born generation, having similar experiences. You know, the talented young person who works hard at school is then trying to get employment. And it was only reported recently on the news, there was a young lady who had lots of qualifications, 100 job applications later, and she still hadn't been placed. And yet she had friends who were not Black, who were not as well qualified as her, who had already got jobs. So if we live and we accept that we live in a systemically racist country, nobody should be surprised that every generation has experienced the feeling of being locked in, trapped, and that takes its toll in the term of complex trauma that all generations have experienced. That's my little bit.
Yeah, I wonder if anyone else can comment on that, because that's interesting, you know, where each generation, and it's something that's, it's really interesting. Like, for example, when you look at the police, and I remember talking, I often talk to young people, and I say, you know, I don't want to be a police, or I'm scared of police. And I say, have you met them? No, but I just know. It's kind of weird how that impact has got on subsequent generations. Not everyone has met the police, but somehow it's almost not as say like an innate fear, but it's quite clear. Hold on a moment. You know, I don't want to go. You know, it's like parents may need to have the talk with their sons or daughters on how to engage with the police. I don't know if that has an impact. Paul, you were going to comment on something.
Yeah, because I think that, and Angela may correct me, but I should have actually said, I think part of the thing with my anger is that I think it went back to when I first arrived and the problems I had at school. And then when I had this experience, which was, to me, it was horrific, and I've held on to it for a long time. I think it goes on to what Dwain then said, that you don't have a chance to get over it to it, because at this time, of course, shortly out is the SAS law. And if any one of us remember living under the SAS law, I know they complain about stop and search now. I suspect the SAS law was worse because you didn't have any monitoring at all. And our lives were a misery. And I can name you numerous occasions when I was stop and searched. And the thing I always remembered about it, and I think this was part of the trauma, is what you had to do to manage it was something that I'll always remember. We'd actually sat down at friends and we would discuss how we would go to certain places, what route we would take. It was actually really, really strange. And then you ended up saying, okay, well, what you need to do is if you go to a bus stop, don't stand at the bus stop if there's any old people there, because they would come along and say, you're going to do this to this old person. If you saw somebody coming along, an old person on your side of the road, you would cross over. So it was a really kind of horrific time. And I think that kind of added to whatever anger that we were feeling. But the one thing I will say though, and I wanted to say after what Angela said, and I really do think that this is a really important thing for me, is that I've been really fortunate, I think, to meet some amazing people, amazingly talented Black people. And I think that we need to remember that we'll have tremendous resilience and steadfastness in our community. And I think that sometimes we have to remind ourselves that we have those amazing qualities. And I think that Angela, to me, really emphasizes the great qualities, I think, that we have in our community, which we do sometimes need to recognize and talk about a lot more.
Yeah, that's true.
Yeah. Well, I guess to a certain degree, if you consider it, we, in terms of resilience, I guess our community, when you look at the Windrush, perhaps they've had no choice because of the issues, and what they were able to do was to come up and find solutions, which we may come on to later. Does anyone else want to?
Could I just say something? One of the things, when we were here in the 60s, And when I went to university, one of the professors said, you know, there was this question about whether Black people, their abilities and their intelligence or whatever. And I remember one of my colleagues at the university said, if you want to assess the resilience of Black people, take a white person who is, you know, lower working class and send him 5,000 miles to another culture, which he'd never been in before. And he said, you would see the result. They couldn't cope as well as Black people have coped here. So therefore, in terms of what we've done and what we had to do, in terms of moving from one culture to another over 5,000 miles, people, some of them were not educated, and they coped with a complex system, and in fact worked and contributed and suffered, as I pointed out, say, people like my mother, you know, job uncertainty, house rent uncertainty, paying more than 50% of your wage for rent, and still survived. Therefore, the capacity of Black people has not yet been assessed. And if we look at that emotional response, which the people who came in the 50s and 60s, that they suffered or they experienced, and they didn't show the same emotional responses we do, the younger ones, because they didn't have the same expectations. What we've got for the future that we must address is the people, the young people today have expectations that the Windrush generation did not have.
Very true.
And therefore, the effects that they are being subjected to are going to cause a lot of difficulties for the future if we don't address the racism that denies them their rights and also the opportunities. And we must point that out to the system, that for the future, we are going to have a tremendous amount of difficulties because people with expectations are going to, you know, the results are going to be shock, denial, etc. And we're not going to get the best out of our society if we subject people with expectations to these traumas of deprivation and injustice.
You better like go on, Angela. And then
sorry. Do you think that there are barriers to addressing racial trauma, though, because of the fact that it's not identified as such, or you know, it's not something that we don't talk about it? Do we actually identify it as you know? Because a lot of these things are racial trauma. You know,
yeah.
you know, trauma is easily perpetuated. So, and it's been, you know, from the time, as you talk about the experiences of people when they first came here, you know, what they had to have a certain amount of resilience because they were faced with rejection. And, you know, and
yeah,
as you said,
you're right. But you see, they didn't have that expectation. You know, my mother, when she came, getting a job, having somewhere to live and something to eat was enough. You see, we're not talking about middle class people who were going to get a job, get married and do that. They worked and they suffered and they endured.
But they didn't expect to be treated in the way that they were treated.
No, but it's not about expectations. I think that if you're from Almond Town and Jonestown and you come here, you are in a very difficult circumstances and you're dealing with it. Because basically you had what I call a young person today who is 15, 16, 17. They have the expectations they've seen on TV or the media, etc.
Yeah.
And they want a car, they want to live in a certain place, they want a holiday.
Yeah.
They want so-and-so. These are what I mean by expectation.
Yeah, sorry.
My mother never took a holiday, she got holiday pay. You got 2 weeks pay and you worked. And that was a big deal for her.
If I could come in on the back of what both Angela and Sir Geoff are saying, The expectation point is actually an interesting and very good point, because I look at my children, who I categorize as being British-born generation. They expect that if they do certain things, then certain opportunities will come their way.
That's correct.
They also talk with their peers, their Asian peers, their white peers, because they've grown up through the same school system, or through the same swimming club, or through the same whatever social activities they enjoy, and they exchange notes. My son was telling me a couple of years ago about sitting down with some of his workmates, and they were a multicolored group, and they were talking about the schools they went to and the places they'd worked before and the universities and so on. And he was able to say, Dad, it's only now that I can truly appreciate what you and Mum have done for us by giving us this type of education, by encouraging us to go to university, because I now understand why I deserve what I'm doing relative to others, because I'm very well qualified. I've done a lot of things which have built my experiences. So I would agree with the messaging that the British-born generation, and there are 2, possibly 3 of them coming through, do have a different set of expectations than the Windrush generation, or even my generation, which some people refer to as the barrel generation.
Yeah, that's right.
And in a country that this is all they've known, it is entirely inappropriate that those expectations are not being met, especially if they do the work and measure up.
That's right. Mm-hmm. We're looking to a whole load of trouble.
Go on, Keith.
Yeah,
Okay.
I would like to say that there's one common denominator running through all of this, and that is the sad truth that we experience oppression, injustices, etc. So whichever generation, that is a common denominator. They are expressing themselves in different ways, and I agree with Sir Geoff and Dwain that this generation have, I wouldn't use expectations so much. I use needs. Their needs are different. The Windrush generation, the needs were basic. They want a shelter. They want food on the table for the children and themselves. Those basic needs had to be met, and so they hadn't time to focus on the other needs, and they were able to tolerate maybe the disrespect and all those things, because basic needs were the priority for them. They want their children to be fed. They want accommodation, and those basic things. Today, those needs are now common to us. Our children don't worry about accommodation too much now. I'm not saying that's not, there aren't issues to do with that, but it's not at the same level like those in the 60s and so forth. And rightly so, what you're saying, they're now looking at the other needs, the need for respect, the need for equality in employment, etc. They're looking at those. And in a sense, maybe Angela would probably may agree with what I'm going to say next, which is that it mirrors the what is called the Maslow hierarchy of needs.
Hierarchy of needs, yeah.
And so
Self-actualization.
yes, we live in another phase where the needs are different now, and those needs are demanding solutions.
Do you think perhaps, I mean, we talk about George Floyd and the Black Lives Matter movement. You notice in the UK, it was predominantly young people. Do they, whereas I look back at the Windrush generation, And I look at my parents, and they not necessarily were complaining, but they were more compliant by saying, "Hold on, let's not necessarily rock the boat, but it is going to be hard." So, you know, whereas I've seen two examples where I see the younger generation, and maybe Dwain's point of British born, are demanding different things and are reacting differently. I use the example of football. I look at the young modern Black players. So the previous generation of footballers just sort of said, no, it's best we get on with it. You know, John Barnes and others, and they've all said, no, we got to get on with this. What you see though with the current Black players, one, they're prepared to walk off the pitch. They are prepared to really confront society. They're saying, oh, no, our demands are different. And certainly with Black Lives Matter movement, I noticed the majority of young people are making demands. So is that what you're saying, is that those needs are different?
But look, can I just say, look at what that has done though. Look at what that has done, because of the fact that people are actually standing up now, kind of saying this is not acceptable. You know, before every football match, for example, there's some kind of announcement about racism and whatever. But what that has done is it's prompted the children of the Windrush generation, then let me say, who were professional footballers, who endured the trauma of racism throughout their period, to now speak and voice. Because we, you know, because prior to that, they were silent. We didn't know, you know, yes, we know that there was racism, but you would never have known, looking at those footballers like Ian Wright and, you know, Andy Cole and all of those who were playing, that they were actually enduring the level of racism that they were until now.
Yeah. It's like the barrister, you know, the barrister who was being treated as the criminal.
Yes.
And therefore, if I'm a barrister, I expect to be treated as a barrister. If I'm a doctor, I expect to be treated as a doctor.
Yes.
And if we walk outside, we're expected to be treated as as the way we think we deserve. And I think the young kids aren't going to put up with not being given that respect.
And rightly so, I would say, because it is what I probably would term, they've gone through life hearing the stories of the bad old days from the parents, and they determine not for that to be inflicted on them now. Many of them are more professional, they're qualified, so there's a need or a demand, I would say more demand, that there is parity of esteem. They are asking for that.
Yeah.
Yes.
Frank, you look as if you
wanted I was going to say,
you were going to.
I agree with, yes, I mean, I agree with that, Keith. I think one of the differences about expectations is because our children, my children, they don't have any other option but to stay and battle it out. Because whereas, you know, my parents, or even I, to a certain extent, could have an option. You know, I could decide that I was going to go and live in Nigeria because of the ties and the contacts and the numerous visits and, you know, property there and money in there and so on. Similarly, you know, my parents took the conscious decision that despite all those obstacles that they faced and discriminations, that they were still better off here than going back to make a living in Nigeria. But there was that option, but they chose not to exercise that option. And for me also, when I was born and brought up here, you know, I've chosen not to exercise the option to live in Nigeria because I have those close ties. But for my children, they haven't got that option. You know, their option of going abroad is the same as any other white kid or any other Asian kid. They don't. So therefore, they have no other. They have to stay and fight it out and battle for their rights, and they won't accept any less. Whereas, you know, if you had some other option but you chose not to exercise it, then you're kind of in a different position. But our kids don't have that option. They don't have that choice.
Yes. So there's could be trauma if in fact they've got bad experiences.
Yes, absolutely, absolutely. And you know, if we have time, I'd like to talk about some of the science about trauma that I found very interesting.
Well, we've been over an hour, and I know we've got to try and keep it short. And I want us to talk about the actual, next steps and solutions. So, and then wrap it up. So, if there's any other points folks want to make around, Frank, if you want to talk about the science, and I know
science is interesting.
Yeah, and I know Dwain has eloquently identified, what racial trauma is in terms of systemic racism. So, Frank, if you wanted to talk about the science,
I will just say briefly. There's increasing evidence that the science can be transmitted from one generation to another via our genes. In the same ways as you get particular characteristics and traits. And there's a lot of science around what's called epigenetics, and how traumas can actually affect your DNA. Your trauma can affect the way these proteins are attached to your DNA, which then leads into what genes are expressed. And there's been fascinating research done in mice where in brief, they've traumatized mice and found out that when those mice have children, they will respond with the same startling to the same trauma that was occasioned to their father. And it looks as if these traumas, which are inherited traumas, at least in mice, and we're finding some evidence in humans, are passed down the male line. So the male offsprings tend to exhibit the same traumas as their parents and grandparents, in terms of mice, anyway.
Yeah, no.
It's not so much on the female side. Anyway, that's a whole other talk.
No, there's even more evidence, and there's something, and I just think this is why this is gaining further ground. There's something known as, sorry to talk a bit of science here, but this is really relevant actually. It's called developmental origins of adult diseases. So the question that clinicians and others are asking, adult diseases like cardiac diseases, like diabetes, etc., where do they originate from? Basically, and this study has come from the Hunger Dutch famine. So what happened in certain parts of Europe, food was on ration. So there were some children that were born during periods of starvation. It turns out, subsequently, future generations of those children actually have certain ailments. They are likely to get diseases like cardiac disease, diabetes, etc. You can Google it. It's called the Barker hypothesis, and we know this. So children, and we definitely know this. Children that are undernourished, that are born at a lower weight, their offsprings will have problems that people are only looking at now.
Yeah,
related to race, but it's clearly related to. But people want to know, where do these diseases originate from? And there's evidence, and we know this. So what happens and the trauma, we know this in the utero. So we know, for example, drinking alcohol or smoking during pregnancy can have an impact on the baby. And when those babies are born, their genes can also, continue. So there's some evidence with that.
Yeah.
I suppose I can add some weight to that, to say, and Frank, it's probably in response to, well, both you and Donald. The son that I had, by the time he was 18 months old, he was, and I've never heard any other child this happen to, but he was actually expelled from nursery because within a matter of days when he went to nursery, he bit 26 children. And he had an anger in him, 18 months I'm talking about, and he had an anger with him that has traveled with him throughout his life. And I definitely feel that is a result of something that has been passed down.
Can I ask one practical question about that, Angela?
Yes.
as his mother, when he was at home with you, because you're talking about under 2, was he biting you and everybody he could lay his teeth on at home?
No.
And for me, that's potentially significant, because if in a wholesome, positive environment, his behavior is different, the question of why the behavior changes is also another factor. And I say that because through my school days, I've seen people behave in ways that when they're with me and we're friends, they don't. It's almost as if they know they're going to be under fire, so they prepare themselves for war. But when they feel safe and they're in a wholesome environment, they're more relaxed. Now, is that genetics, or is that just using the experience of different environments so that you're not blindsided? This is going down a whole new rabbit hole. But all I would say is genetics clearly will have a part to play, but it's that age-old debate, isn't it? Is it about nature or nurture? And this is where I think, Donald, when we open up the conversation about next steps, it'll be very interesting to see how much there is out there that we can draw on in order to do something about the trauma we've all experienced and described. Over to you, sir.
I think we should. We've been over an hour, so I'd like us to discuss next steps and possible solutions. And just to set the ball in motion, I thought Frank made a really good point about, you know, some of our young people and, you know, with knife crime. And I've heard others say this, there is a lack of self-esteem, there's a lack of self-belief, and that's partly where it comes from. And maybe one of the solutions is to recognize this, talk about this, and then come up with how we can help some young people. But I don't know.
If I may say, there's been some very good work on this in Canada with the indigenous peoples who have the same problems as the indigenous people in Australia and the Native Americans, and I think by extrapolation, a lot of Black communities. And what they found has worked to a large extent in Canada is number one, recognizing that there's a problem of the trauma passed down the generations. Number two, involving the community in solving that. So it's involved the elders, the younger people talking to the older people. It's involved sharing some of the cultural aspects which were kind of taken away by the white community. It's involved language. It's involved recognizing artifacts. So it's essentially restoring that cultural esteem that was stripped from them. And that's certainly it's brought down delinquency rates and alcoholism rates and reduced the suicide rates amongst the younger people that are being affected by these things. So there's a whole community section. Of course, those that are particularly, there's also been a lot of counseling. So people, not just counseling, people who understand the background and who understand the cultural significance of not seeing yourself reflected in the mainstream or not seeing yourself in television. And so that counseling has also been important. But one of the things I wanted to bring out was involving the community and that talking to your elders and sharing experiences and building back your esteem. I think something along those lines would be required here.
Yeah, what do you think, Ajay? You're nodding, and I mentioned something that's interesting, and then we'll get. I think Paul wanted to comment, but you mentioned something.
I just wanted to. Yeah, I mean, I think what Frank said is absolutely brilliant, because I mean, in my role, I meet a lot of people who are clearly depressed, suffering from depression, anxiety, and I know a number have had a mental breakdown. And one of the things that's always concerned me, because I'm supposed to be an expert, of course, is that I I think I mentioned this to Angela, I've never actually had the training sometimes to deal with people who are having those problems. So if they complain to me about the way they've been treated, I'm trying to help them find a solution to that. But I'm actually trying to help somebody who is depressed or has had a mental breakdown, which is a completely different thing. And I've had a conversation with my boss about this much more recently, in terms of how do we really help somebody who comes to us and says, I believe I've been a victim of discrimination. I go along and do an investigation into it, but often when it's finished, I'm not happy. Now, for instance, I interviewed somebody, a young, highly intelligent young Black woman a couple of months back. And for over an hour, she cried nonstop. Cried nonstop. And it was so bad at the end of it, she said to me, I can't go back into that organization. I can't go back. And she hasn't been able to go back. But I can't actually help her with that. So I think that what Francis says, that, you know, you meet people whose self-esteem and self-worth are just gone. And it seems to me, and I'm not an expert, you know, but that's what makes us human. That's what makes us whole. And it's been removed. So I think that without being an expert, it seems that if we need to find some sort of a process about, as you said, how you heal or put it back, because you just can't survive without those things as a human being.
And I definitely think, sorry, Keith, carry on.
Go ahead, Angie.
No, I was going to say that that's why it's important to raise awareness about the support mechanisms, because there are support mechanisms out there, but the problem is, you know, it's like a closely guarded secret. Nobody knows about it. You know, there are the well-known organizations, you know, for example, the British Association for Counselling, but we know that even though I'm part of it, that's seen as a kind of white middle-class organization. And people, and whether people feel that they can access that is something else. But there are other organizations that, you know, that specifically support people with the understanding of the, you know, the heritage issues and the, you know, the inequality and all of that. You know, you've got the Black, African and Asian Therapy Network, for example. You know, that's the largest organization of, you know, of counsellors from Black and Asian backgrounds. But again, you hear about the BACP, but you don't hear about the BAATN. Nobody hears about that. So how do we raise awareness about that? So it kind of normalizes people's feelings so that they feel that they can access it. And I think that's
relationship to that, Angela, sorry to cut you, but you mentioned this earlier on. So do you think there is a greater recognition around racial trauma? Because I guess that's the key. You know, if the therapist or those counselors or the experts don't recognize racial trauma, then the difficulty is, how can the community seek help?
Can I just dive in on this one? Because I think we have an opportunity here. I know from talking with Angela that Angela has deep knowledge of Black professionals who are both psychologists and counsellors. And Angela, correct me if I get this wrong. I believe our community today is in a much stronger position than we were in the 1950s. And what I believe one of the next steps ought to be is that we should be explicit about the variety of groups and organizations where Black experts in psychology, in counseling, are operating, because that's how our community is going to help itself. Look, most of you will have heard me talk about the pincer strategy. This for me is an example of where that strategy applies. Systemic racism is the underlying cause of all the misery that we've been discussing. That is not being addressed well enough, but it has to be. But while that is not being addressed, we can help ourselves because we have a growing number of experts in this area that we should be encouraging members of our community who have been traumatized to reach out to get the help so that they can rebuild their resilience, so that they can rebuild their sense of self, and so that they can endure, because the help is there. And so I'm hoping, Angela, you won't be too shy in listing the many organizations you're aware of. And I know our good friend Frank has been doing a bit of homework, and he's aware of some organizations as well. And we should just echo those organizations so that viewers and listeners will be able to follow them up. You know, we're in the 21st century. Most people can be found on the internet, so that they can start reaching out and getting the help. So I'm optimistic. We can do a lot to help ourselves from this moment forward.
So
I would like to say,
Keith, before you come in,
okay,
I just want to ask, so from the side that we may have experts, it looks like the concept of racial trauma has been more and more recognized. What about from the community side? Are the community themselves aware of the trauma, or or of accepting, as Angela says, being vulnerable, to recognize it, to say, what? Yeah, I realize I'm angry. I'm going to go and seek some help. I'm realizing that I'm perpetrating knife crime. Okay, let's see how we can get help. Sorry, Keith, but as we're talking about solutions, there's experts now. We can but it's the other side. So Keith.
Yeah, I think your observation is an important one to consider as we discuss. What I think I'm agreeing on strongly is that Dwain has said it before, and one or two others. We have within our community more experts today than before, who can use their skills to help to find solutions to problems within our community. So those resources are there. I think, though, what we may have to do is not to wait for them to reach out to us. We should be able to find avenues and pockets whereby we can not just do our professional work where we are, but also, I'm afraid to say it, but we have dual responsibility. We have our professional responsibility, where we work and so forth. But because of our sensitivity to the needs of our community, we have double responsibility. And I'm saying we can't let the victims come to us. Let us find avenues to reach out to them and to engage with them, and we know they're hurting, but we're able to bring to them other solutions, more rational solutions to their problems. And it's our problems too, because what affects them ultimately comes back to us. Whether we are financially, educationally better off, it still affects all of us. We're in the same boat sailing. So I'm saying that what we can do is to find, it's not easy, I must admit, but we have to find ways, search for ways in which we can reach out to those needs that are there. And I don't want to, because some of you know that I have a background in terms of faith, a faith background. But in short, there's a story, and I think Donald would know about it too, because he's a faith man. The story of the prodigal, of the Good Samaritan. Now that story, most people think it's this man on the Jericho road. It was an accident that he stumbled on this man who was hurt, and reached out to the man. But when you dig deeper into that story, it was intentional. The things he used to address the problem. He had with him bandages. He had with him oil. He had with him some spirit. And all those three things were part of a medical kit. He was intentional. And I'm saying that we have our own areas of work. We have those tools. In a way, don't let us stumble on a problem. Let us go out there and confront the problem.
But Angela, aren't you doing something with your church group around trauma and dealing with that? Is that the story you're able to share with us?
Yes, definitely. Certainly, we've recognised that, and I suppose it has been more prevalent since the pandemic, that we've seen, you know, the issues and the mental health of our church communities suffer as well, because they are the community. Let's face it. So what the church has done, it's set up a counselling service, and it's not just for the church. I mean, anyone, you know, it's for the community. Anyone can access it as well, and it's free. And I think that's the thing, it's free. They don't have to go to a private counselling. Free counselling sessions that's being offered and free support.
What's your church community called, Angela?
It's the Church of God of Prophecy.
So anybody can look up Church of God of Prophecy and ultimately will be connected to somebody who is participating in this service.
In the Sentient Counselling Centre service.
I must say, the Church of God of Prophecy must be one of the oldest Black churches in the UK. They've been going since, I think, at least the 60s.
Yeah.
Well, most of the Black majority churches kicked off in the 50s when they were rejected by the Church of England and the the white-run churches.
Yeah.
So, you know, early 50s is when they all sort of kicked off.
That's right.
Yeah.
But in a sense, what we could do, like I'm engaged here now with all of you as colleagues, but listen to Angela and others here. I should be able to take back to my church maybe what can be offered.
Yeah.
And vice versa. You know, what I do is mainly on education. I go to other churches too. Like I'm doing something in the next couple of weeks for another group. So we got to reach out. That's my message.
Yeah.
We can't wait for them to come to us.
Yeah.
I think
We have in the UK more than 5,000 Black majority churches. The whole of the UK is mapped by a variety of Black majority churches. So we have an open door. We have the expertise, we have the people, we have the churches, we are connected with the community. And God knows you've only got to look around to see the ways that trauma is impacting all generations. So I agree with you. This is a low-hanging fruit. We shouldn't be waiting for somebody to come and do this to us. We should be providing this level of support ourselves to our community.
Can I just say that, I mean, I agree with that, but I think what Donald and Keith are trying to say is that we probably need a public awareness campaign to go.
Yeah, this is it. I wonder whether or not people are, as we say, part of the discussion is both recognizing it and conquer it.
Yeah.
I wonder whether or not that many of us know, probably have suffered some form of an experience, it may be referred to, but may not categorize it as racial trauma. So because we all experience racism and the stress. I mean, there's points where people have said racism kills. So, and everyone will understand what racism is, but they may not phrase it as a form of racial trauma that potentially that could you know, that they could seek help to try to help support them. That's what I wonder. There
is a barrister, and forgive me if I'm wrong, I think his name is David Stevenson, and I can't remember what chambers he works for, but he's an expert on, you may have heard of him, Angela, on discrimination, and he is absolute and brilliant. You need somebody, because he talks about racial trauma, and I deliberately have focused on it. And one of the major reasons why I focused on it is because one of the new attacks that we come under is this constant use of the word victimhood. And that's how certain people keep on phrasing what in effect is mainly trauma.
Yeah.
So that's why I agree with you, and I agree with Keith that before that, and I think Dwain's completely right. I think it's there, the structure is there, some of the facilities are there, but we need to have some sort of a public awareness campaign to make people have a greater understanding of what it is that they're experiencing, in order that they can go and get the help,
yeah,
and seek the help.
and it's not, as you say, because you're right, there is this there's discussion taking place at the moment. You're right, Paul, where you've been described as
it's a concerted effort. Yes.
Yeah, about you're just a victim.
Yes.
And so what happens then?
It's interesting that Mind. I was thinking that Mind, the organisation Mind, they describe trauma as a life sentence for a crime you did not commit.
Okay.
Well, so that's a really good point.
True. I remember that. That's that's how they categorize trauma.
Yeah, I mean, let's hope people listen to this video. And I mean, I guess we're coming to the end, and I want each of you to make any final words before I do a summing up. But because it's something I had a conversation with Paul about, and in our first Ask Our Expert, we analyzed the Sewell report, and Paul and I discussed this, and I've discussed it with other people, and some people, when they read the foreword by Tony Sewell, couldn't read anymore because what was written they found incredibly traumatic.
Yes.
They literally just found it physically sickening.
Yeah.
And here's the point, and I said to some of those that read it, Donald, I said, you guys are, that's trauma, that is. And they went, you're right. So partly the reason why I say that, not to go over the Sewell report, but for some people, they don't recognize it as trauma. They said, I couldn't read it afterwards. I was angry, I was upset, etc., etc. So, and they use that, maybe I was just emotional. And I said, actually, that might actually be trauma. So maybe part of the next steps is making the community aware, and then perhaps seeking advice.
Because the definition of trauma is an emotional response.
Yeah.
Yeah. That's it. That, causes, could cause subsequent illness.
Yeah.
So trauma is an emotional response.
Well, no, that's why many people, particularly Black people, have only seen that video, the sad situation with George Floyd, and said, no, I can't see it again.
Yeah, we've got different emotional responses.
Yeah.
And that makes us human.
Exactly.
But also the realization of it is because many Black people experience racism. What they saw with George Floyd was a horror beyond the horrors. It was, and it may triggered many things. It was around individual racism. It may have brought in the Angela and Francis said intergenerational. It brought a whole host of things that perhaps related to complex. So what some people I've spoken to, some of them couldn't understand why they were so emotional seeing that video. It was like, I can't believe it, Donald. I was like, and it's because they may have experienced racism, but have sort of really downplayed it to say, I'm just going to get on with it, as we've talked about the Windrush. But then this happened, and it's literally, as they say, opened the floodgates.
Yeah, I think what has happened in the past, for whatever reason, I'm not the expert on this here, but maybe Angie or Frank or others might be more the expert, but we tend to, as a way to deal with a problem, either confront the problem or we suppress the problem.
Yeah.
And I think a lot of our folks earlier on in life, or parents and so forth, coming through those traumatic experiences, the only way to survive was to suppress it. And but today's a different order of things. As I said, back to our earlier discussion, the needs are different.
Yeah.
And we're focusing that area of esteem and respect and so forth. We security, etc. And we're looking for different ways to confront those issues. than just to suppress them now.
Okay. So any final comments before we
Yes.
wrap up? Because we want to make sure, I know we
Yeah,
start.
Donald, if I can just kick off the final comment. You've asked several times about awareness building campaign.
Yeah.
As the chairman of Reach Society, I'm certainly going to put this topic on our management team agenda, because we have a number of ways of actually putting it into our program of activities so that more people, and we're in touch with hundreds of people on a monthly basis, will be aware of the issue of trauma and the fact that there are lots of skilled people in our community with the expertise who can help them. So, you know, Reach Society is in a perfect position to do that. We also have a smart health project, which we launched during the April Virtual Careers Conference. Trauma and mental health is one of the areas I know, because we were delighted to have Angela take part in that. And we will continue to raise awareness so that the many will realize that they shouldn't be suppressing it, because it will injure their health.
Yeah.
They should be seeking help to expunge it and to find ways of conquering it.
No, you're right. And just talk one last bit of science before everyone else comments on. Dr. Mr. Morgan and I were discussing this. Frank will probably be aware, but at the end of your chromosome, you've got something called telomeres, and they're like the end of the shoelace. It protects the shoelace. And what studies have shown that in African-American men of the same age as white, their telomeres are much shorter. So they've aged, even, you know, they've accelerated aged. So if you take someone who's 50 and you look at the end of their chromosomes, you see in African-American, it's much shorter than a white 50-year-old. So they're aging faster.
Yeah, absolutely. Yes, that's a very interesting project. I mean, racism kills. I mean, quite apart from the telomeres, one of the basic mechanisms is that racism causes stress, which puts up your cortisol, which has a negative effect on your cardiovascular system. And there've been some very good studies, for example, amongst American doctors, American Black doctors who have the same qualifications and the same financial situation and the same, you know, work opportunities, still die several years before their white counterparts. And the difference is to do with the racism they experience and the constant tension they're under to maintain their positions, and the microaggressions, which you can measure. There's various ways of measuring microaggressions, and you can relate that to the changes in the immune system and the changes in the cortisol production, which is why you live less long.
So we'd like to thank everyone for coming, for giving them time, for telling some personal accounts, and I really appreciate you, particularly Angela, very powerful. And so what was described in terms of trauma was there are three main areas. There's the idea of acute, a single event, which is, then there's also a repeat that can lead to chronic, and there's then the complex, which Angela perfectly defined, you know, as multiple traumatic events. What is quite clear, and Dwain really made a powerful point, is the impact of systemic racism on one's health, and the idea of racial trauma, which perhaps wasn't accepted or recognized, is really now starting to be recognized. And I think more so what's happened with George Floyd, or how our community is dealing with this. Because the impact of trauma can be, and it seems to be manifested in various ways. Maybe it's related to the fact of low self-esteem, lack of self-belief. That can actually have an impact on our community. And this could be the issue with our young men. And what we've heard today is recognizing that there are solutions around engagement that has actually had an impact on that. So maybe that is the symptoms. And once you know the symptoms, there's clearly some solutions associated with that. There's a recognition of why some of us are angry, and recognizing that is the idea of racial trauma. And there are clearly now experts that can actually provide help. And what's really needed is for the community to recognize what they're going through, and not, which has been said, and it's true, that it's been labeled as being a victim, where it is not the case, that this occurs both in individual racism, systemic racism, vicarious trauma that's been described, etc. So this is something that's going to be looked at more. We're going to try and write a very small report. This discussion will take place with other groups, and it's really about building awareness. And by being aware, one can then come up with solutions. So again, I really want to thank everyone. I'd like to thank you all for your contribution, your openness, your honesty. As been mentioned, it's about being vulnerable. So I'd like to thank Emeritus Professor Sir Geoff Palmer, OBE, Dr. Dwain Neil OBE, Professor Frank Chinegwundoh, MBE, Angela Clarke, Paul Riddell, and Dr. Keith Davidson. My name is Donald Palmer, and it's really been a privilege to chair this session and meet again with the Ask Our Experts. Take care, stay well, and stay safe.